It's just lovely to be with you again. I see some familiar faces and probably some that I don't know, but it's really nice to be here. And I feel a little bit of a fraud when it's advertised as an author visit because I feel like I'm more an interfaith worker than I am an author in any shape or form. But I did just last year publish a book, so I suppose that allows me to temporarily have the title of author. So I'm going to maybe just share a little bit with you how the book came about, or just the journey, what takes someone from Scotland to the Pacific island of Samoa to end up, living and working there and doing studies and eventually writing my book. So I'm going to kind of break the evening up into maybe 10 minutes of just setting a bit of a context for you that, the story of how we ended up in the Pacific, and then maybe 20 minutes on the book and just some reflections at the end of that, and then a time for questions for Q&A, just to ask anything at all, that comes to your mind. Just feel free to ask me. So I suppose the story kind of began way back in my hometown in Elgin, which is in the northeast of Scotland. And I was brought up in a very working class family. And in that family, actually, books and education were not particularly emphasized, or wasn't really part of our thing. My mum was a cleaner, my dad was an electrician, and we just lived a very straightforward life. Went to Sunday school and things like that, but my family were not at all religious. And so I left school at 15 with absolutely no qualifications whatsoever. And in the 1970s, a lot of people who left school early, just women particularly, went straight into typing. So ended up as a typist, working as a typist. And then through a whole series of things that happened, I became a Bahá'í at 17. And I guess that was quite unusual in the 1970s in the northeast of Scotland. Um, in fact, my parents really thought I had joined some strange cult and were really worried about me. And I was literally the only Baha'i in the town. And I think there was a Baha'i community in Aberdeen and Inverness, and Elgin's kind of in between both those places. And I was it. That was it. I was a young 17-year-old, a strange child, I guess. I had decided that I wanted to be a Baha'i. I was very, very drawn to the idea that all the world religions are from the same source. I don't know why that attracted me particularly, um, but it just resonated with me, and so I suppose knock on quite a number of years, and there's no surprise that I ended up working in interfaith relations. So I met my husband when I was 19. We got married when I was 21, had my first child at 22. And Nick already had a child. So by the time I was 26, I had four children. And the title of the book that I'm going to explore with you is Women and Religion, Empowerment and Constraint. And of course, I looked at that in the Pacific island of Samoa, but I think I just wanted to say that that's a theme that runs through so many aspects of my life. Because initially, I think it was becoming a Baha'i that really made me curious about education. There's some very strong, I don't know what scripture, I suppose you would call it, that says that, we are man, woman, our minds rich in gems of inestimable value, and the education alone helps it to reveal its treasures and enables mankind to benefit therefrom. So that whole idea that within all of us there are incredible treasures, and that through education, and that can be spiritual education, material education, but just through education, we begin to reveal our gems and offer them, for the betterment of humanity. So when my youngest son went to school, so like I say, four children by 26, I would have been 30 at that point. I thought, what on earth am I going to do in my life now? I'd been a mum for 9 years. And when we first got married, Nick and I worked in the fish factory. And I thought, I just really don't want to go back to the fish factory. And it was probably about a few weeks before he was due to go to school. There was a thing called a Workers' Educational Association. I don't know if any of you know of it. It was like an educational association, like outside of the formal education system, where a speaker would come along, talk to you, on any sort of subject. And the critical thing for me was there was a creche. So, so I used to go to this workers' educational once a week, pop Tom into the creche from the age of 3 to 5 when he was ready to go to school. It was one morning a week. And there would be something, sometimes it was flower arranging, sometimes it was people who traveled the world, sometimes it was all sorts of different things. On this particular morning, the woman she was like, she must have been a I mean, now they've got languages for this. I think she was a life coach or something similar. And she asked, it was all women, she asked us to close our eyes and, imagine a journey where there were absolutely no obstacles in our lives. And we were to imagine what would we do if there were no obstacles? What would you most like to do with your life? And nobody had ever asked me that. Do you know what I mean? Leaving school at 15, working having kids, working in a fish factory. I mean, nobody had ever said, what do you actually want to do with your life? And just kind of rolled along. And I thought, oh my goodness, I would really love to go to university and I'd love to travel and I'd love to live in like far away from Scotland with the children in a completely different culture. And I'd love to publish a book. And, I had all these things in my mind that I'd love to do. And at the end of this kind of thoughtful meditation, she said, okay, everyone had to share and we all shared and we had all sorts of fantastical things. Well, to me, that felt utterly fantastical at that time. I was totally uneducated, mum with 4 kids, actually, we lived in a croft 4 miles from the nearest village. And for the first 3 years, it didn't even have a toilet. So, I mean, was no, this was way like my wildest fantasy. But she said something really interesting. She immediately said, if that is your dream, what steps are you taking right now? What step will you take when you leave here tonight to make that dream a reality? And for some reason, that just hit such a chord with me that I went home and I said to Nick, I'm going to go to night classes and I'm going to take a higher English. I'm going to just do English and see how I get on. So I passed that. And then there was a thing called an Access to University course that you could go to one day a week and take 4 subjects. If you passed all 4 subjects, it was for mature students, you could go straight into university. So my husband took a day a week off work, made sure all the kids were all right. I drove into Aberdeen, I did the workers' educational, and I passed. So when Tom went off to school at 5, I jumped in the car and had my first day at university. And actually, interestingly enough, and the courses that I took were just because I didn't know what I was going to do. So I took courses that really interested me. I took women's studies, I took anthropology, I took religious studies, I did English literature. I ended up you have to, in Scotland, you have to, for your final 2 years, do a specialist subject. So I took cultural history where you could blend all those things together. And I mean, it's incredible when I think about it now, because this was the 1990s. Two really powerful things happened to me at university. One, in the anthropology course, we studied Margaret Mead and coming of age in Samoa. And I was just thought this was like seemed like the most incredible place. I loved the indigenous culture and the way that they thought, the way that she portrayed them. I mean, there's been controversy about Margaret Mead now, but at that time, for me, it was just my magic island in the sun. And I also joined the interfaith group at Aberdeen University. So Samoa and interfaith both came to be probably the two, next to my faith, being a Bahá'í, the most significant things in terms of how this book came about. So in my final year at university, in the religious studies course, we were given a book to read, and it was called Hinnell's Handbook of Living Religions. And I read this book, and the final chapter of the book was about the Baha'i faith. And actually, when I read it, it was written by a sociologist, and every other chapter had been written by an adherent of that particular faith. But this had been written by a sociologist who wasn't a Baha'i. And he wrote as a sociologist saying this is a social movement. Don't think it's a religion. It really is a social movement, and it had all these things why he felt it was a social movement. And I was furious because I thought, no, it's not. This is my religion, and I know it's my religion, but how do I know it's my religion? So the professor at the time, Professor Thrower, he said, well, why don't you do your final dissertation proving that your faith, your Baha'i faith, is a religion and not a social movement? And I thought, oh, that would be great. So I just studied all the things, all the context, all the things that made a religion and not a social movement from a kind of sociological, anthropological point of view. So it was things like the charismatic founder, mythic history, ritual symbol taboo, the development of a community, it was just so many different things that come out in academic stuff about what and what isn't a religion. And so I submitted it and I got a first, which was amazing to me. I mean, I couldn't believe that this had happened. So then what happens when that happens at university? They offer you the opportunity to go on and do further study. And so the piece of work I had done was called A Study of the Forces Motivating the Creation of Baha'i Religious Culture. Sounds very long-winded and academic, but I was just basically trying to prove that what I believed was a religion and not a social movement. That's all I was trying to do. And my wonderful professor, Professor Jim Thrower was his name. He said to me, there isn't a lot of academic anthropological work written about the Baha'i faith. We will fund you to go anywhere in the world and do your master's on a Baha'i community somewhere outside of Scotland, somewhere in the world. Like, this was unbelievable. And remember, this is all within a few years of having this workers' educational conversation. I went home and I said, and Nick and I, we talked about, so there was all sorts of things. The story would be too long if I told you how it all, emerged that it would be Samoa. But basically, I needed to find a safe place to take to take the family. And I needed to have a big enough and interesting enough Baha'i community to study. So on the island of Samoa, the king at that time, or the head of state, was called Malietoa Tunamafili II, and he was a Baha'i. And there was a Baha'i temple in Samoa, and there was a large Baha'i community there. And so what I decided to do was do a comparison looking at the Baha'is of Samoa and Tonga and their impact on the local culture. So we dragged the family out there. It was I mean, a master's is a little bit, it's much shorter than a PhD. We did 4 months in the Pacific. I wrote my master's, but while I was there, I was very intrigued by the role of women in religion in the Pacific. They were so deeply religious in the Pacific Islands. I'd met Indigenous healers. I knew there was a whole, thing about Indigenous spirituality that wove itself into the Christianity that was there and into the Baha'i community even as well. It was just, I was fascinated. So when they asked if I'd then do my PhD on the Baha'i faith, I said no. I thought I was too close, to write about my own religion for a number of years. So, but I said I would really like to look at, women and religion in Samoa and really look at all the different faith traditions, explore, what empowers them, what constrains them, what are their stories, and it just, I suppose yeah, that was the start, really. So we uprooted the family, sold the family home, moved to the Pacific island of Samoa, and within quite a short time I was teaching at the university there, so converted the PhD study to part-time so that I could work and write and do my thesis. And there was just so just so many incredible experiences, so many beautiful women, so many things that completely transformed the way I see religion and spirituality, through the experiences of being there in the Pacific, and things that challenged me in all sorts of ways about the dual role of religion and how it can simultaneously really empower women and their spirituality. But the other side of that coin, there are also things about religious traditions that can constrain women and need to be challenged. So, of course, in a PhD, you're doing the challenging, you're doing the trying to say this needs to be looked at, this needs to be addressed, this needs at least to be discussed. And eventually, the PhD sort of became structured in three specific ways. The first section really was, setting the historical context and then looking at the indigenous spirituality of Samoa. What were the myths and the legends? How did the women that were spiritual healers there, traditional healers, what was their religious, how had that evolved from the past to the present? How did it impact on the different religious traditions that were there in Samoa? The middle section was what I called mainline Christianity. So it was Methodist, Congregationalist, and Catholic, really looking at those traditions and the role of women there, and again, what empowered and constrained them. And the third section was newer religious movements to the Pacific. So I looked at the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. I looked at the Bahá'í community and what empowered and constrained women there. And then also to the kind of newer American megachurch, charismatic Christianity and was having an influence in the Pacific, and the role of, women there again, and what empowered and constrained them. So the PH, we're there. And the thing about being there was I absolutely, everything about it spoke to me about that I wanted to work with communities. I wanted to do things with communities. I wanted to be with communities. I mean, I enjoyed academic work, but I knew that wasn't me. I wasn't going to be an academic for the rest of my life. I really wanted to be with communities. And so when we came back to Scotland, um, I said to Nick, I don't want to go into academia. I want to, finish the PhD, because I still had to write up some bits and pieces of it. But I don't want to work in academia. What am I going to do? And he thought I was unemployable, really, to be honest. But job came up in Interfaith. And so in 2002, we came back January 2002. The job in Interfaith Scotland was advertised in the April 2002, and by the August, I was working in Glasgow as the first ever development officer for Interfaith Scotland. There was no paid employees in Scotland at that time. I was the first, and Interfaith had just started. Really, well, it hadn't just started. There had been Interfaith in Scotland, but in a voluntary capacity across the country. And so it was a fantastic, and actually interfaith is very much like doing anthropology. It's like doing religious studies. It's like doing women's studies. It's like doing cultural history. I mean, everything that I had learnt at university had prepared me, I think, for working in the interfaith field. Um, but the thing that swung me the job was the fact that I'd actually gone to an interfaith group while I'd been at university in Aberdeen. So that practical experience. And then the PhD sat there. It sat there and it sat there because there's no way I had the time to get it published when, when I was working full time, trying to develop a national interfaith organization. And I always had a deep sense of, not, well, perhaps not deeper, I'd have done something about it sooner, but a sense of guilt that because one of the key strategies I used in my PhD was to use the voices of Samoan women. When there were stories to be told, it was their stories. It was the stories of women that I'd interviewed. It was stories of women that became my friends. It was even in presenting academic papers in the Pacific, I refused to present any paper unless a Samoan was doing it with me. So it was their story, it was their voices. And I kind of felt it's terrible, really, that I mean, my PhD did sit in the university in Samoa because obviously it's sat at Aberdeen University, it's sat at in the University of Samoa. I mean, I got my doctorate. Um, but I just thought I need to do something. And then last year, and it was just last year. Last year, I was invited to do an interfaith service in the Bahá'í Temple in Samoa for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And I realized it was exactly 20 years since I'd submitted my PhD. And I thought, I'm going to go to, this is the time. This is the time I have to turn it into some kind of book. But you know what? I don't know. Some of you are probably academics and know the process of turning a doctorate into a book. I took a horrible, ridiculous shortcut. I'm going to tell you what I did, and you're going to be utterly ashamed of me. What I did was I literally put in one paragraph saying, this is what I found at the turn of the 21st century. You know, this is what I found in Samoa. And this is my PhD. And I'm asking two questions, what's changed and what's stayed the same. And I'm hoping that Samoan academics now and in the future will either enjoy what I've written or challenge what I've written, basically. And that's all I added to the doctorate. And that was it. I didn't have there's just no way I could go back and rewrite the whole thing and say, now, 20 years later, this is what I've found. And I just thought, let others do that, but let this that I found, at the turn of the century become a book. And so I worked again with a Samoan called Steve Percival. He's part Samoan, part German, part Tongan. And he really helped me just sort of craft, when I say craft it into a book, I mean, I can give you the PDF of it. I mean, I'm not at all precious about it. You can read it for free. I'll stick the PDF in the in the in the chat for you. You can read it. And so what I thought I'd do is I'd publish enough to take with me to Samoa and do a book launch there and just give the whole lot to the university in Samoa. And that's how the book came about. I mean, I'm still thinking when I retire, which is the next stage in a couple of months' time or a month's time even, I will probably just put it online, as an audio, as a book that people can download and use or do whatever they want with. I'm not I'm not caring about selling it or anything. I just want it to be out there. But mostly I wanted it to be available for Samoans. That was the whole point of publishing it, was that all these wonderful people that had engaged with me, that had told their stories, that had um, you know. So I think that's the context. I think I've taken longer than I meant to for the context. So that's how it came about. And what were the findings? I mean, that would be what you'd be probably more interested in hearing the context. And it was different things in different contexts, but I suppose the conclusion was that religion per se, you know, the charismatic founders, the writings, the scripture, the beauty of the of religions really, really empower women. But the institutional structures that have developed through male lenses, this is not new stuff, over centuries, it can quite often constrain them. And that in a particular Indigenous context, that was quite interesting, the interplay between Indigenous spirituality, Christianity, and newer religions. They just wove such interesting patterns. And I can give an example of empowerment and constraint from a very Samoan, with a very Samoan story, if you like. And this would be, and most of you here, I mean, I see Morgana's with us as well, so I'll share some Indigenous bits as well, which I think would be really interesting to Morgana, but this would be in a Christian context. So in Samoa, generally, the matais or the chiefs of the village are men. So 90% and more of the elected representatives of families are male. And so when Christianity came in the 1800s to Samoa, the Samoans weren't quite sure where they were going to fit the whaifiao or the minister into this structure, because they knew the minister was really, really important, but they didn't want to give these Western ministers the power that the chiefs had in a village, but they wanted to rank them very high. So, along with the village council, which is this elected body of male chiefs, the male minister or Fifiao in all the different churches ranked very high and got to sit in the village council, but was not allowed to actually influence any of the decisions of the council. Now that's quite important. In the traditional Samoan context, the chiefs are given the best of everything. And their role is to redistribute that to the rest of the community, to the rest of the community, to the village, to where they live. Now, the Victorian missionaries were given that same honour, that the very best of what the villagers had was given to the ministers. But they didn't really recognise or understand that they were supposed to redistribute in some way. So they became the wealthiest people, still are the wealthiest people in the villages in Samoa. Now, what impact does that have on a woman? Traditionally, to become a chief in the village, you have to have served for quite a long time. And so mostly that's men in their 40s or 50s would become chiefs. And so the wives of a chief then are quite high ranking as well in their 40s or 50s. But to become a Fifiao or a minister, you might be a young man in your 20s. And the woman that you've married is as high ranking as you are. So suddenly a young woman in a village is catapulted from just being a young woman in the village with no title to being one of the highest ranking women in the village. It was an amazing way to empower young Samoan women. And, they had loads of roles in the villages, supporting the Whaifiao, the minister, working in the churches, working with the women's groups, working with the children, making decisions, becoming quite wealthy, thinking about how that money would be spent. Very often they spent it for the good of the village, in all fairness, but, they were just so empowered by not only the theology of the religion and the scripture and everything that would normally empower you about a religious tradition, but they become empowered and powerful in the village. Now, the constraint was if that minister died, that woman had to return immediately to her natal village with all her children. And because she's not been allowed to work in anything other than the church, she has no qualifications outside of the church. So she's immediately back in her village and, and really is it's within I think 2 or 3 weeks. If she dies, the Whaifiao goes to one of the colleges and just chooses himself a younger wife who comes to the village, and that cycle repeats itself. And so there was nothing put in place to support the widows of the ministers of the church, and that was really tragic. And this was presented at a conference called the Samoan Association of Women Graduate Conferences, and immediately women were standing up in the audience. They were crying, saying, "This happened to my mum." One of my closest friends in Samoa, and it's called Ruta. She said her parents were even missionaries, from Samoa to Tuvalu, and came back. The father died. And they ended up at the back of a house of an auntie with nothing, impoverished. And so, this would be one of the empowering and constraining things. So it's not really to do with the religion, but it is and it isn't. It's about social structures, it's about institutions, it's about the culture at the time and, and the culture. And so when I went back to Samoa this time, I said, has that changed? And they said, well, people are talking about it 20 years later, but it hasn't really changed radically. So that might be one particular way, within charismatic Christianity, the women were very empowered literally Women's Aglow, for example, was there in Samoa. And the women were running the services, the women were doing the charismatic preaching, the women were doing just everything. They ran the whole show. But in their charismatic, ecstatic, situations, I mean, I could read it and it would give you an idea of this is me going to one of these meetings, which was quite different to let's see if I can remember what page it was, 189, which is quite different to what I was used to, um, as a Baha'i, the different ways that people express themselves. But what I found was that it was incredibly cathartic. The women were just able to let out, all their concerns, all their worries, all their fears. It was really very moving, actually, incredibly moving. Um, but very often it was about the abuse that they were experiencing. And so what was happening, I felt, was that they were able. So this is the meeting, and you'll get a kind of a sense of it. So this is from the book itself, because I think that's what authors are supposed to do, aren't they? Read a little bit. So I'm going to just read this little bit. And it's quite different, like as I said. So I'm seeing this through my lens, and remember, I'm not, from this tradition. So I arrived at 5:30, and the meeting had already started. A dozen women were singing and praying. Grace, who was expecting my arrival, met me at the door. I sat as inconspicuously as possible in the third row from the front. The building was a bit run down. There was a lectern at the front, Samoan mats placed in front of this, and then about 6 rows of seats. 7 of the women sat in the front row, 5 women and 2 children in the second row, and then myself in the third. Grace stood and orchestrated the meeting from close to the lectern, although interestingly, she never once went and spoke from the lectern. The charismatic choruses continued for a good half an hour with the women visibly being moved by them, some weeping, some praying, some crying aloud, crying loudly, Yesu, Yesu. Between the choruses, Grace shouted loudly, sometimes in English, I think for my benefit, sometimes in Samoan, particular phrases which she repeated throughout the meeting. Sometimes these were phrases of thanks, we thank you, Jesus. Sometimes it was emphatic statements. God is not a liar, he keeps his promises. Sometimes it was a plea for help. Give us your peace. Whenever there was a lull in the singing or praying, Grace would repeat a phrase and everyone would reply. Another example would be, God is good, and everyone would reply, yes, God is good. There was an obvious format to the meeting, although the participants state that it's unstructured and they're being moved by the Spirit. The next stage of the meeting was a build-up of the emotional experience. Women who felt they could not worship totally because of emotional burdens or anxieties in their hearts were encouraged to get the worries out and give them to Jesus. At this stage, 4 of the women were weeping considerably. One by one, Grace went to the women and laid her hands on them, spending around 5 minutes with each. As she laid her hands on um, an upset woman, other women joined in. The distressed woman was then surrounded by 3 or 4 women, all praying, speaking in tongues, singing, and generally empathizing with her. Fleeting thought went through my mind, sorry about this, that 1 or 2 of the women went to the grieving woman in order to hear what the problem was in a sort of nosy way. But the only reason I mention is that I noticed one woman lightly pushing another aside so she could get a bit closer. She wasn't laying on her hands or praying, but she was just listening intently. One woman began to laugh hysterically. The noise in the room rose to a crescendo of weeping, praying, singing, laughing, shouting, and speaking in tongues. All of the grievances were husband related. Mistreatment, adultery, being the common upset. Grace repeatedly asked that the upset be bound and the woman receive filimu, which is peace. When this phase was over, more singing and praying began. This time the assumption was that the women who were upset had been freed up to praise God more fully. Again, the emotional fervour was extreme. The laughing women continued to laugh. Grace joined in the laughter, jumping up and down, stamping her feet. There was no doubt that this was a release valve for the women, and the frustrations, the upsets, and the anxieties of the week were temporarily relieved by this cathartic experience. Throughout the whole meeting, Grace orchestrated the next phase of development. Although not a pastor, Her role appeared to be pastor-like, and that she was in charge of the way the service proceeded. The final phase of the meeting was more sharing of experiences. First, Grace gave a short sermon. Then the women, two more had joined the group by this time, sat on mats at the front in a circle and spoke of their problems. One woman who sat next to me told me the stories were all about adultery of the husbands. One woman whose husband had made a young girl pregnant felt justice had been done when the girl went to America and was shot in the neck and killed. The Women's Aglow Forum, I could see, gave these women both relief in the cathartic experience, a sense of being loved, especially when all the hands were laid on and the prayers were being said, and an arena for discussing their problems. I have no doubt they returned home feeling in some way unburdened. And I would think it was a mechanism for coping with their situation rather than a mechanism for changing their situation, was what Women's Aglow offered. And then, I went on to analyze some of the theology behind Women's Aglow, which was that women have to submit to men as the men are submitting to Jesus. And so there was a whole disempowerment around the narrative of submission, but then there was this cathartic experience and it just was repeating itself. There didn't seem to be any way of actually amending the situation. So although that would have been empowering for the woman to be there and to have felt that love and that release and that cathartic ability to speak about their problems, the structure, that was being taught to them was about submission. And this I felt was not empowering. I thought this was constraining for them. So, I mean, that's just one small example of the kinds of the looking through my particular lens at that time, which was anthropology, sociology, whatever, at what was happening in front of me. And I tried to use that lens in whatever situation I found myself in whatever religious tradition I was looking at that particular time. And in all of them, they were different. They were also different cultures. Every religious tradition had quite a different sense of culture, every denomination, and different stories about what was incredibly empowering and what was constraining. But perhaps for Morgana and for the rest of you as well, some of the most incredible experiences I had were spending time with the Indigenous women, the actual traditional healers. And this is something that has existed from way pre the Christian era of Samoa, that the women were the traditional healers. And they would work within a traditional um, spirit or spiritual, spirit, whatever you want to call it, hierarchy of uh, yeah, spirits, basically, for want of a better word. It was called aitu, or ghosts or spirits, and that at times people would become sick with something called ma'aitu, which is ghost sickness. And the women, of these traditional healers, these taulasea, would heal the woman. So it was a very empowering religious, heal anyone. It wasn't just women who got ma'aitu, who got ghost sickness. It was women, it was men, it was pastors, it was chiefs. Lots of people, would at different stages get this particular sickness, which was a type of spirit possession, where they'd either stop speaking, maybe eat much less, be very, they call it musu, be just very withdrawn, um, and they would be ill in some way, and the taulasea would be called in to treat them. And it was interesting because I would try to dig a bit deeper to find out what was going on here. And I mean, one particular story I can tell you from, um, that the particular pastor's wife, and she was from the Pacific Theological Seminary in Fiji. And she had been with her husband in Fiji, and he'd studied there because only in Samoa, only the men can be pastors, not the women. And so her husband had been studying there, they'd come back to Samoa, they were in their village, and she became Musu. She became ill, and nothing they seemed to do was making her any better. So they called in the Taulasea, the traditional indigenous healer, and who, they gather everyone present. There's laying on of hands, there's praying. I've got a whole section in the book that talks about what the Taoiseach do because, that was part of the story, but it's quite long-winded. And then the Aitu, or the spirit that's possessed the woman and made her ill, speaks and says why she is ill. And so, what in this particular context, the woman said, the spirit or woman, depends on your interpretation, said, when I was in Fiji, I was sexually assaulted, and I will not get well until the person who did this to me the spirit said she will not get well until the person who did this in Fiji is brought to justice. And the person was named. And it turned out it had been accurate, and that was it. Now, to me, as an anthropologist or a sociologist, I felt that this ghost sickness gave people a tool to say the unsayable, to speak the unspeakable, to bring to the fore. There's no way this pastor's wife could just say to the village or say to her husband, "Oh, by the way, I was sexually assaulted in Fiji." It was not the kind of thing that could be said out loud, and it wasn't the kind of thing that could be said out loud, particularly by a pastor's wife. But the spirit that possessed her, if that's what I mean, I don't personally believe it was a spirit. I feel it was her way of expressing this unexpressible thing. So this came out, and then the person was dealt with and she got well. So, but it was the skill of the traditional indigenous healer that has to create if you like, the ambience, the situation, is to know the right words, is to know how to draw, there has to be a drama to draw the spirit out, but so that the people don't think it's just this woman, it's the spirit, and so that again, I felt that the indigenous women of Samoa had a very definite role in healing um, sicknesses that couldn't be healed by Western medicine or couldn't be healed in the usual ways. I mean, we might have counselors and therapists and rape crisis centers and all sorts of things, but in a Samoan village, what they have is their traditional indigenous taulasea, their traditional indigenous women that are very skilled. Um, and so, there was an empowering role for a woman within the village context that had, all sorts of elements of religious um, language and things in there. And, I wondered how that sat with the church, and I discovered that pastors would happily call in Taoiseach, that Taoiseach were also deeply Christian and would go to church and and we're spiritual women, as, so they'd have their deep Christianity as well as their indigenous spirituality, and that those things where we in the West try to put things into boxes, and this would go with this one, and this goes here, this goes there. That doesn't happen in the Pacific. And this is not particularly a story about women, but another story from the Pacific Theological Seminary. And one of the pastors there was telling me a story about when he'd graduated as a pastor and he'd gone home to his village in Samoa. And he was right, he was not in close to the seashore. He was an inland village, and they had gathered in the village phono, and all the chiefs had come, and they were all so proud of him. And it was, really a beautiful. The kava was being passed round, and they were singing hymns, and it was a beautiful evening. And he said, and then a huge crab, came clunking across the linoleum floor of the valley, and everyone was quiet. One of the chiefs, one of the older chiefs of the village said, "Oh, it is your grandfather. He's come to be with us tonight." And everyone's reverent and quiet. And, the orator then said some really powerful words, and everyone was, touched, really touched. And the crab, off it went, and the festivities continued. So I thought, I'm just going to be direct here. So I said to this pastor who just gotten his degree from the Pacific Theological Seminary, "Okay, was that a crab or your grandfather?" And he laughed and he said, "Of course it was my grandfather." So there was this incredible kind of I don't know what you'd call it. So, I've tried to capture some of those kind of stories of the way that Indigenous spirituality is woven into, and then also the challenges. Because, for example, Benny Hinn came to Samoa. Apia Stadium was absolutely packed to the gunnels because this was a huge charismatic preacher from, I think, South America. Some of you might know better. But in the midst of all his preaching, he started to talk about the Taulasea being witches in Samoa. And, that then I was kind of like, I was like, oh no, I just spent all this time and knew they were wonderful women. And so so you've got the indigenous spirituality, mainline Christianity, absolutely accepting Catholics, Methodists, and Congregationalists, very happy with that interweaving of traditional culture. And then this newer type of American evangelical coming and trying to demonize the culture and the situation. And so there was all of this woven together and hopefully woven together in the book in a way that might be interesting to people. And there was different every section, every chapter, every religion has different stories of empowerment and constraint. Um, and I just began to feel that religion is a very complex thing. And I have found that more and more as I've engaged with diverse faith traditions in the interfaith field. And as Margaret's going to talk a little bit about Surya, there you have beautiful religion. Islam is a religion that empowers women, that Muhammad was very strong on the empowerment of women. And then you have the development of something like the Taliban, where they're saying that women can't be educated. And there you have this young girl fleeing from that situation. So there you have an empowering religion that's been used and, I don't know, twisted through the lens of a particular um, ideology to disempower women. So yeah, we have to be very, very careful, I think, on how we use our religion. All religions are incredible resources. They're wonderful things. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be connected with that which is divine, the mystery of life, the beauty of all of it. Um, and then it can be used because it reaches into the deepest motivation of human hearts and human souls and human minds. So that can also be misused. And, that I came away from that. And I've seen that in every tradition, in every religious tradition, the empowerment that's there, the beauty that's there, the joy that's there, and then the way that it can be manipulated and, can be used to constrain, particularly women, actually, but sometimes men, but particularly women. And that's changing. And I think there's many more radical feminists within, the different faith traditions that are challenging all of that, or not even feminists, just women whose voices are now being heard. And I mean, in my own faith tradition, there's that sense that men and women are the wings of a bird, and that only when both wings are allowed, are equally developed and have the potential, will the bird of humanity fly. So, I mean, we just have to keep working towards a vision where men and women are equal. And it doesn't mean they have to do exactly the same thing, but there's equal opportunities to develop in whichever way you feel interested. And there's a whole section in there on transgender because within Samoa they have Fa'afafine, which is men Fa'afafine means like a woman that live as women, and that was in the 90s. That was completely new to me. Now it's spoken about, and explored, and there's discourse about it. And so that's a whole other section. Yeah, there's I mean, it was just the most incredible journey. But I don't regret coming back and being involved in interfaith either, because I kind of feel that journey has continued in so many ways. And yeah, I could read a bit more from the book, but I've just looked at the time. It's 10 to 8. I can't believe I've just waffled for that long.
Well, that is
So
not waffling. That is such a rich, deep experience you are allowing us to step into with you. Just absolutely beautiful. Maureen, thank you. I want to give everyone the opportunity to respond if they have anything that they would like to add, even just sharing our gratitude with you. But oh my goodness, so deeply moving, Maureen, to hear
Oh,
about your
thank you. Was, but
experience.
because my parents weren't religious, and I remember having a beautiful spiritual experience at a Catholic monastery in the northeast of Scotland called Plascarden Abbey. I was a Sunday school teacher at the in the Protestant churches because I loved kids, and so there was this exposure to religion anyway, and I was drawn to it. And then one Sunday afternoon, there was I was in the park in Elgin with one of my friends. We were both 17-year-olds. I'll be honest, I think we're probably out trying to spot the local talent, see where the local boys were hanging out. And there was a hall called the Museum Hall, and there was a placard outside it saying Bahá'í exhibition, it's free, come and have a look around. Now, I had never heard the word Bahá'í, and I remember saying to my friend whose name was Caroline, "Oh, that must be those little Japanese plants. I'm sure that'll be, you know, because I think it was bonsai. I was saying, let's go and have a look at these plants. It's a bit boring. There's no lads out here. So we went in, and there was Baha'is that I'd mentioned earlier. There's a Baha'i community in Inverness and Aberdeen, and they had come through and they'd put up an exhibition in Elgin. And I walked around that exhibition and thought, oh yeah, like we spoke about all the major religions being from the same source. It spoke about equality of men and women, the need for everyone to have access and rights to education. Extremes of wealth and poverty were not helpful, that, everyone had to have fair access to their resources, and just lots and lots of things that really appealed to me. I think I hadn't, that point, probably it was more of in my mind, this just makes sense. It wasn't that I had a deep spiritual experience or anything. And there was an American Canadian woman there. Her name was Marjorie Georgie. And she gave me a book. And it was just a small blue book called The Baha'i Faith. And she said, we have a discussion evening here on Thursdays. You're very welcome to come. I went home and I read the book, and it had things in there about the history of the Baha'i Faith as well as the teachings. And I really liked it. Went back. I went a couple of Thursdays. She was probably much more Canadian American than Scottish. We Scots are definitely not pushy about our faith. I mean, not even remotely. But she just said to me, "So, do you think, are you a Baha'i?" And I went, "Oh yeah, I must be. I agree with all this." And that was kind of it. I mean, honestly, that was it. And she said, "Well, we have a summer school in Inverness this summer. Why don't you come along?" Now, I had no idea. Really, she probably paid for me to go to that summer school, because I now know that you pay to go to summer schools. They're not free. But I rocked up I was almost 18 by then, because I think the summer school was in the July and I turned 18 in the August. And by that time, I'd left home. I'd gone to live in Aberdeen. I was working in an office in Aberdeen, but I came through for this, went to that summer school, and was just blown away by the atmosphere, the spirituality, the prayers, the songs, the people. I guess you'll all have had similar religious experiences in different contexts. And that was it. I was a Baha'i, really. And because I'd moved to Aberdeen, there was a big Baha'i community there and a lot of young people at university, and that. So it was very easy then to feel part of a community that were doing things, that was happening, that was, and I actually, within a very short time, I actually took myself off to Africa. In fact, I was 19 when I went to Africa. And the reason I did that was, yeah, it was, I mean, I don't know, the 1970s culture in working class Scotland wasn't particularly healthy. There was a lot of racism, misogyny, just a lot of that. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, if I don't go and challenge this upbringing in some radical way, maybe I'll still have some of those ideas in my head and my heart. I need to do something. So I worked 3 jobs over a summer, and I just took myself off to Malawi. I went on my own. It's completely mad. I wouldn't do it now. Went on my own to Malawi and spent time with the Malawian Baha'is, just for 3 months, 3.5, 4 months. Traveled round, stayed in villages, got malaria, got dysentery, the whole lot. You know what I mean? Traveled on buses, just But I came back from there knowing that I would never, ever again be, or just would never be racist because the people that I met in Malawi were just such beautiful, good souls everywhere. I never felt threatened. I never felt endangered. I never felt, I just felt that I was with good people. And so, yeah, and my dad, who'd spent quite a lot of his life working as an electrician for Balfour and Beatty in Africa, was absolutely adamant that I was going to be murdered, and and of course I wasn't. So, so that was a very enriching experience as well. Perhaps another story, another day.
I think for the people who don't haven't had those opportunities to go and be in very different places and exploring like that and getting to make those connections with actual people, um,
Mm,
that our hope in this space is that we're able to tie those threads in some ways for people, and you are doing that for us right here just by sharing what you have experienced. Because when we create these connections, these people are real, these traditions are real. um,
mm,
and as you say, once we feel that, it changes you forever.
mm. And next week I'm going to be in Guyana in South America, unexpectedly. And this is actually connected to Samoa. It's the most bizarre story, really. When we first went to Samoa, we lived in a traditional Samoan village in a place called Fa'atuia. And the matriarch of that family was called Faleono. And, we lived in the village. It was great. We loved it. We were there. And the daughter of Faleona was called Seila, and she would have been about 1920 at that time, or maybe a slightly older. And by the time we left, she had moved to Barbados and gotten married. But, we stayed in touch with all our Samoan friends. And she was coming to Israel, to Haifa, to a Baha'i convention. This is before the Israeli, the situation with Israel and Gaza. And she just got in touch and said, "Oh, I'm very close. Can I come and visit?" So I said, "Yeah, of course you can come visit. Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Come visit." And she said, then she phoned up a week later, "Can I bring my daughter, Fatawi, she's in Canada and is coming to see me because I'm in London?" And yeah, I said, "Yeah, bring your daughter, Fatawi, no problem." And then she said, "Can I just bring my very best friend who's from Guyana, but is working in Israel at the moment?" She was doing volunteering for the Baha'i World Centre there. And I said, "Yeah, bring her." Her name was Roshni. So this young, beautiful young Guyanese woman, I mean, when I say young, she was in her 30s, came to our home and, they were with us for a couple of weeks. And our son, our youngest son, we've got four children, our youngest son was 38 at the time. And she just, hit it off and they started writing back and forth. She came, stayed with us at Christmas time. And then he went over and went on a mini Baha'i pilgrimage. And then she came back and stayed with us again. And then last May, they asked her to get married. And then this year, and next Saturday, they're getting married. And it was really the connection with Samoa, weirdly enough. And this thread, a Samoan coming to stay with a Scot and bringing her best friend, who's Guyanese, to Scotland with her, who's now about to marry our son. So, I mean, it's just this world is so interconnected, and we forget that sometimes. We just forget how beautifully interconnected it is. And her family, actually, although she's a Baha'i, her family are Hindu. And there's a big Hindu population in Guyana, and her family are Hindu. And so I'm just kind of excited to meet them. We're having a henna night, I think, the night before the wedding. And then we're having a sort of Baha'i, Guyanese, Hindu, goodness knows what kind of wedding we're going to have. And but it's exciting. So the world is and all of this, we're all interconnected here. Am I in Middlesbrough? I can see Mays there in Glasgow. Some of you are over in America and others, and Margaret and I met on Iona, beautiful site of pilgrimage and deep spirituality, from within the Christian tradition. And I don't know how all these connections happen, but they happen. And It's really lovely. So I think now looking back at my book, I might have written something completely different, having done 20 years in interfaith, but that's who I was 20 years ago. You know what I mean? That's what I found. That was my experience. And so it is what it is. And there.
It's so
So
beautiful. So beautiful. And do you know what? I
mm,
posed the question to you that someone posed to you. Um,
mm,
you're stepping into a new phase of your life. You're about to
I
leave
am.
Interfaith Scotland. And so maybe it's the time to have that dream again of what is next, because you certainly have incredible, beautiful work to continue to do in perhaps new directions in this world. And we're
Thank you.
grateful that you're
Thank
connected
you.
with us, really.
It's a strange thing, but I'm being called in my heart to focus on our local area. Just locally, just be in community where you are. You know, sometimes I think when you're young, you're dashing off to find, whatever it is you think you're going to find by d dashing off to all these exciting places. But now I kind of feel like it's almost like every person is a new country. Every soul you meet is a new experience. Every conversation you have opens up new avenues of learning. And I don't have to go too far for that. I'm just really happy to do it where I am. Yeah, that I think that's the next phase, but
Oh, wonderful.
who knows what the world gives to us or, takes away. You just don't know. You just have to be in the moment.